Julia Martha Thomas was a teacher and twice widowed. After the death of her second husband in 1873, she lived alone in Richmond on Park Road, in Mayfield Cottages, sometimes called Vine Cottages at No. 2. The house was a two-story, semi-detached townhouse made of gray stone, with gardens on the front and rear of which were located. At that time, the area was not densely populated. Although the blitz of her house was a dad called hole in the wall, George Henry is glad Julia Thomas's doctor. He described her as a small, well-dressed lady of about 54 years old. According to Elliot O'Donnell, who collected the testimony of her contemporaries, in his introduction to the transcript of Webster's trial, Thomas had an excitable temperament and was considered eccentric. She often traveled without informing her friends and relatives of her whereabouts for weeks or months. Thomas belonged to the lower middle class and, accordingly, was not rich. But she dressed up and wore jewelry to give the impression of a wealthy woman. Her desire to hire a maid is probably due as much to her desire to gain a certain status in society as to practicality. She had a reputation for being a harsh hostess. Her irregular habits made it difficult for her to find and retain employees. Until 1879th year, she managed to keep only one maid at work for a long time. On January 29, 1879, Thomas hired Kate Webster as a maid. The innate Kate Lowler was born in the Clan, County Wexford, in about 1849. Later, the Daily Telegraph described her as a tall, powerfully built woman with a height of 5 feet and 5 inches. (165 centimeters), with yellow skin, covered with a lot of freckles, and with large and prominent teeth. The details of her early life are unknown, as many of her later autobiographical statements turned out to be unverified. But she claimed to have been married to a sailor, a captain named Webster, with whom she had 4 children. According to her, all the children died within a short time. In December 1864, at the age of 15, Webster was imprisoned in Wexford for embezzlement. In 1867th year, she came to England. In February 1868, she was sentenced to 4 years of hard labor for a similar crime in Liverpool. In January 1872, Webster was released from prison, and in 1873, she moved to Ross Gardens in Hammersmith, London, where she became friends with the Porter family next door. On the 18th of April, 1874, in the city of Kingston-upon-Thames, she gave birth to a son, whom she named John. The identity of the father is unknown, since she mentioned 3 different men at different times. One of them, named Strong, was her accomplice in further thefts and robberies. She later stated that she was in a desperate situation, because after Strong left her, she was forced to commit crimes in order to support herself and the child. She often moved around West London, going by various names: Webb, Webster, Gypsum, Gibbons, and Lawler. While living in Teddington, she was arrested and convicted in May of 1875. On 36 charges of embezzlement. She was sentenced to 18 months in Wandsworth Prison. Shortly after her release from prison, she was arrested again for embezzlement, and in February of 1877th year was sentenced to imprisonment for another 12 months. In her absence, her young son was cared for by Sir Chris, a friend who worked as a cleaner for Miss Loder in Richmond. In January 1879, Sarah Chris, who worked in the Loder house, fell ill, and Webster temporarily replaced her. Loder was a friend of Julia Martha Thomas and knew of her desire to find a maid. She recommended Webster. Thomas hired Webster and apparently did not inquire about the past of her new maid. Soon, the relationship between the two women deteriorated rapidly. Thomas didn't like the way Webster worked, and she often criticized her.
Webster later said, "At first I thought she was a nice old lady, but I found her very demanding. And she did a lot of things to bother me while I was working. When I finished work in my rooms, she followed me and pointed out the places where, according to her, I did not clean, which indicated a hostile attitude towards me."
In turn, Webster became increasingly indignant with her mistress to the point that Thomas tried to persuade friends to stay with her, as she did not like being alone with Webster. It was decided that Webster would resign on February 28th. Thomas noted her decision. This entry was the last in the diary. Warned Catherine about the dismissal. Webster persuaded Thomas to let her stay at work for another 3 days, until Sunday the 2nd of March. On that day, she was supposed to leave for half a day and return in time to help Thomas prepare for evening service at the local Presbyterian church. However, this time Webster visited a local pub and returned late, delaying Thomas's departure. The women quarreled. Some parishioners later reported that Thomas seemed very excited at church. She told a parishioner friend that she had been delayed because her maid had negligently not returned on time, and that Webster, having received a reproach, had become terribly angry. Thomas returned home early around 9 o'clock in the evening and got into an argument with Webster. According to Webster's final confession, Mrs. Thomas came in and went upstairs.
"I went up after her, and we had an argument that turned into a quarrel in anger and rage. I pushed her down the stairs to the first floor. She fell heavily, and I was terrified at the sight of what had happened. I lost all control over myself, and in order not to let her scream and get me into trouble, I grabbed her by the throat.
In the struggle, she was strangled, and I threw her on the floor." Neighbors, housewife Thomas Eve and her mother heard one dull sound, similar to the sound of a chair falling, but then did not pay attention to it. At Thomas Webster's house, she began to dispose of the body, dismembered and boiled him in a laundry boiler, and burned the bones in the hearth. She later described her actions.
"I decided to do everything possible to get rid of the body. I separated the head from the body with a razor, which I then used to cut the flesh. I also used a saw and a meat cleaver to cut the body. I prepared a cauldron of water to boil the body and prevent identification. As soon as I managed to cut up the body, I put the pieces in the cauldron and boiled them. I opened the stomach with a knife and burned as many parts as I could."
Neighbors noticed an unusual, unpleasant smell. Webster spoke later about how she had to endure the terrible sight that opened before her and the terrible smell. Nevertheless, the activity at Mainfield Cottage, too, did not seem out of the ordinary. As in many households, it was customary to start washing on Monday early in the morning. In the days that followed, Webster continued to clean Thomas's house and clothes, creating the appearance of a normal daily life for people who came in for orders. She was packing Thomas's dismembered remains into a black Gladstone valise and a hatbox tied with a rope. She could not fit the head and one leg of the murdered woman into the container, so she got rid of them separately. She threw her leg in the trash at Twickenham and buried her head near Thomas's house. At the stable of Holland vs. Pub, the head was discovered 131 years later. On the 4th of March, Webster went to Hammersmith to visit her old neighbors, the Porters, whom she had not seen for 6 years. Webster was wearing a silk Thomas dress. She took with her a valise filled with the remains of Thomas. Webster introduced herself to Porter as Mrs. Thomas. She claimed that since the last time she met them, she had married, had a child, was widowed, and inherited a house in Richmond from an aunt. She invited Porter and his son Robert to the Oxford and Cambridge Arms in Barnes. On the way, she got rid of the bag. Perhaps she dropped it into the Thames while the Porters were in the pub. The bag was never found. Then Webster asked young Robert Porter if he would help her move a heavy box from the house at Mayfield Cottages to the station. As they were crossing the bridge, Webster threw the box into the Thames. She managed to explain her actions to Robert and not arouse his suspicions. The next day, the box was found in shallow water at a river bank miles downstream. It was found by coal carrier Henry Wheatley. He was driving his cart past the Barnes Railway Bridge at 7 in the morning. At first he thought that there might be stolen items in the box. Wheatley pulled out the box and opened it, finding that there were body parts wrapped in brown paper. The discovery was immediately reported to the police. The remains were examined by a doctor, who determined that the remains consist of a torso without entrails and a leg. One foot was missing. The remains belonged to a woman. The head was missing. It was later suggested that Webster got rid of the head by throwing it into the river. Around the same time, a human foot with an ankle was found in Twickenham. Although it was clear that the foot and ankle belonged to the same body, there was nothing connecting the finds with the victim. It was not possible to identify them. The doctor who examined the remains mistakenly attributed them to a young victim with very dark hair. The inquiry on the 10th and 11th of March led to the recognition of the fact of committing a crime, without identifying the perpetrator. The unidentified remains were buried on March 19 at Barnes Cemetery. The press gave the unsolved murder the name Barnes Mystery. There were rumors that the body was used for dissecting the study of anatomy. It was later alleged that Webster offered neighbors 2 pots of lard, presumably obtained when cooking the remains of Thomas. However, no evidence was presented at the subsequent trial, which makes it possible to accept this story as just a legend. Moreover, there are several versions of this story. The owner of a nearby pub said that Webster came to her and tried to sell what she called the best fat. Leonard Reginald Gribble, a criminologist writer, commented on this message. There is no acceptable evidence that such a disgusting trade took place. It is most likely that this episode is on a par with stories from an extensive collection of false stories about participants and victims of famous crimes. Webster continued to reside at Mayfield Cottage too, posing as Thomas. She wore the clothes of her last employer and conducted business with merchants under a newly adopted guise. On the 9th of March, she made an agreement with the local innkeeper John Church about the sale of furniture and other property of Thomas, so that he could furnish his pub Risen Sun. He agreed to pay £68, together with an advance of £18. By the time the vans arrived on March 18, the suspicions of the neighbors, who had not seen Thomas for almost 2 weeks, began to increase. Her neighbor in the townhouse, Miss Eve, asked the carriers who allowed the goods to be taken out. They answered Mrs. Thomas and pointed to Webster. Realizing that she had been exposed, Webster immediately took to flight, catching the train to Liverpool, firm where she left for her family home, Veni Scorti. Meanwhile, Church realized that he had been deceived. When he searched Thomas's clothes in the van, he found a letter addressed to the genuine Thomas. The police were called and searched the house. The police found traces of blood, burnt finger bones, and fat deposits behind the boiler. They found a letter left by Webster, which gave the police the criminal's home address in Ireland. The police immediately sent a wanted notice with a description of Webster and her son. Scotland Yard detectives soon established that Webster and her son had sailed to Ireland aboard a coal steamer. The Chief Constable of the Royal Irish Constabulary in Wexford has established that the woman Scotland Yard was looking for was arrested by his men for embezzlement 14 years ago. The Irish police found her uncle's farm in Killin, near Anniscordy, and on the 29th of March, they arrested the criminal. She was taken to Kingston, and from there sent to Richmond under the escort of police officers from Scotland Yard. After learning that Webster was accused of murder, her uncle refused to shelter her son, and the authorities sent the boy to a local workhouse where he was supposed to stay, until a place was found for him in an industrial school. The murder became a sensation on both sides of the Irish Sea. Many people came to Richmond specifically to look at the Mayfield cottage. When the arrested Webster was being taken from Anniscordy to Dublin, crowds of people gathered at almost every station to look at the criminal and mock her. According to the Manchester Guardian newspaper, the preliminary hearings at the magistrates' court were attended by many privileged and curious personalities, including several ladies. The Times reported that when Webster first appeared at the Richmond Magistrates' Court, a huge crowd gathered outside the building. There is great excitement. On the 2nd of July, 1879, Webster appeared before the Central Criminal Court of the Old Bailey. Due to the great public interest in the case, the prosecution team was headed by Solicitor General Sir Harding Giffard. Webster was defended by prominent London lawyer Warner Slike. The trial was presided over by George Danman. The court attracted the same attention as the hearing in Richmond aroused the interest of all segments of society. The Crown Prince of Sweden, the future King Gustav V, has been following the process since the fourth day. For 6 days, the court heard the testimony of witnesses, on the basis of which the story of Thomas's death was compiled. Before the trial, Webster tried to accuse the innkeeper John Church and his former neighbor Porter. But both had solid alibis, and they were cleared of any involvement in the murder. Webster declared her innocence. The defense emphasized the indirect nature of the evidence, and her attachment to her son, according to the defense, proved that she was not capable of murder. However, Webster's unpopularity in society, her imperturbable appearance, and the indifference of the defense played a role. A particular blow to the accused was inflicted by the hatter Maria Darden, who testified at the trial that Webster had visited her a week before the murder and said that she was going to go to Birmingham to sell part of the property, jewelry, and the house that her aunt had left her. The jury took this as a sign that Webster had planned the murder in advance and convicted her after a meeting that took an hour and a quarter. After the jury returned a verdict before sentencing, with Judge Webster asked if there was any way to avoid the death penalty. She claimed to be pregnant in an apparent attempt to avoid the death penalty. As reported by the Low Times, there was confidence, if not confusion, which, of course, did not correspond at all to the solemnity of the occasion. The judge stated that in his 32 years of work, he had never faced such a question. As a result, the court secretary suggested resorting to an outdated board of matrons, recruited from women who were present at the meeting, to determine whether Webster had a mobile fetus. 12 women were sworn in, along with a surgeon named Bond. They escorted Webster to a private room for an examination, which took only a couple of minutes. They returned with the verdict that Webster had no movable fetus, although this did not necessarily mean that she was not pregnant. This difference prompted the chairman of the Society of Obstetricians of London to protest against the use of the outdated assumption in medicine that an unborn child is not alive until the mother feels its movement. A few days before the scheduled execution, the Minister of the Interior, Richard Cross, filed an appeal on behalf of Webster, which was rejected with an official statement that after considering the proposed arguments, the minister managed to show any sufficient grounds to justify his advice to Her Majesty to intervene in the course of the law. Before the execution, Webster made two statements admitting her guilt. She tried to accuse Strong, the father of her child, saying that he participated in the murder and was responsible for involving her in a life of crime. On July 28, the night before her execution, she recanted her first confession, saying that only she was guilty of the crime, and admitted that Church, Porter, and Strong had nothing to do with it. The next day, at 9 in the morning, she was hanged by the executioner, William Marwood, who used the newly invented technique of a long fall that caused instant death. After the death was confirmed, the body was buried in an unmarked grave in one of the prison's exercise yards. The crowd waiting outside cheered the black flag raised above the prison walls, which meant that the sentence had been carried out. The day after Webster's execution, an auction was held at the Mayfield Cottage address to sell Thomas's property. The innkeeper John tried to purchase Thomas's furniture, including her other personal belongings, including her pocket watch, and the knife with which Thomas's body was dismembered. The cauldron in which Thomas's body was boiled was sold for 6 shillings. Other visitors to the auction took pebbles and twigs from her garden as souvenirs. The house remained uninhabited until 1897 year, because no one wanted to live where the murder took place. According to the tenant, even then the servants were reluctant to work in the infamous house. Later it was rumored that the ghost of a nun could be seen at the place where Thomas was buried. In 1952, naturalist David Attenborough and his wife Jane purchased a house located between the former Mayfield Cottage, which have survived to the present day, and the hall, which was abandoned after closing in 2007 year. In the year 2009, Attenborough acquired it for subsequent restoration. On the 22nd of October, 2010 year, workers who were excavating behind an old pub found a dark round object that turned out to be a female skull. It was buried under a foundation that had stood for at least 40 years on the side of the pub stable. Rumors immediately spread that it was the skull of Julia Martha Thomas. The coroner demanded that the Richmond police conduct an investigation to determine the identity and circumstances of her death. Radiocarbon analysis conducted by experts from the University of Edinburgh showed that the skull belonged to a man who lived between 1650 and 1880 years. But the skull itself was found to be the top layer of Victorian tiles. Marks found on the skull coincided with Webster's story about how she threw her victim down the stairs. There was not much collagen, which is consistent with the version about boiling the remains of Thomas. In July of the year 2011, the coroner concluded that the skull belonged to Julia Thomas. DNA analysis was impractical because Thomas died childless and her relatives could not be found. In addition, there are no records of where her body was buried. The coroner pronounced a verdict of unlawful killing, closing an open verdict rendered in 1879 year. The cause of Thomas's death was listed as strangulation and head trauma. The police called the result a good example of how good old-fashioned detective work, historical records, and scientific and technological progress together solved the mystery of the Barns. The murder had a noticeable impact on the society of Victorian England and Ireland. The event caused a sensation and was widely covered by the press. The Dublin Freeman's Journal Edsir called the crime one of the most sensational and terrible chapters in the annals of human malice. The press was teeming with detailed descriptions and details of this terrible crime. Webster was so popular that a few weeks after her arrest, Madame Tussauds exhibited her wax figure for those who wanted to see the Richmond killer. The statue was also exhibited in the 20th century, along with images of other famous murderers, the couple Burke and Dick, and Dr. Crippen. A few days after the killer's death, an enterprising publishing house from Trend released a souvenir booklet. The Life, Trial and Execution of Kate Webster sold for a penny. It was advertised as containing 20 colorful pages describing her full story with the judge's closing speech, verdict, and interesting information along with her last words and a full-page engraving of her execution. The weekly newspaper Illustrated News came out with a souvenir cover with episodes of Webster's last day. Visiting the prisoner with friends, tying hands, the final rites of raising the black flag, and finally filling the coffin with lime. The case was reflected in street ballads based on the melodies of popular songs. Shortly after Webster's arrest, the Southwark printer and publisher Satch wrote a ballad, "The Murder and Dismemberment of an Old Lady from Barnes," based on the motif of a popular song from the American Civil War. A moment before the battle, Mom. The end of the process. Satch wrote another ballad to the tune of the song Banished from Home. Webster presented herself as a vicious, desperate, and reckless woman, and her crime is both monstrous and scandalous. First of all, respect was expected from the servants. The act of extreme step violence shown by Webster against his mistress caused deep concern. At that time, about 40% of women worked as domestic workers in the general population, from the richest homes to respectable working-class families. Servants and their masters lived and worked in the immediate vicinity. The honesty and diligence of the servants were a constant cause for concern. The servants were paid very sparsely. Theft was a common occurrence. And if Webster had managed to sell Thomas furniture to John Church, she would have received an amount equivalent to her salary for 2 or 3 years. Another reason for the negative attitude towards Webster was her attempt to impersonate Thomas for 2 weeks. She played the role of a middle-class woman, for which it was enough for her to behave correctly and, accordingly, dress. The innkeeper John George, whom Webster tried to accuse, was himself a servant at one time and achieved an increase in social status through effective managing your pub. To succeed, to change one's position through work was the norm of that time. Webster, on the other hand, briefly assumed the guise of a representative of the middle class. Many Victorians may have been worried that Webster violated the accepted norms of femininity. The ideal of that era was a highly moral, passive, physically weak woman. Webster seemed to be the complete opposite of this ideal and was painted in the blackest colors, with an emphasis on her lack of femininity. Elliot O'Donnell, in his introduction to the transcript of court records, described Webster as not only cruel, ferocious, and shocking, but the darkest of the dark characters. The personality is so sinister and barbaric that it is difficult to perceive it as human. In the newspapers, Webster was called gloomy, repulsive, and, although a reporter from DP Illustrated Paper and Illustrated Times commented that she was not as unpleasant as she was described, the appearance of Webster's behavior was perceived as key signs of her naturally criminal nature. It was believed that crimes were committed by the scum of society at the bottom. Repeat offenders who prefer a life of drunkenness and theft, thrift, and hard work. Her strong physique, perhaps a consequence of the hard physical labor that she earned for a living. It went against the perception of the majority of the middle class that women have physical weakness. Some commentators saw evidence of her criminal nature in her facial features. O'Donnell noticed that her squinting eyes, as he declared, were not uncommon among murderers. This is a feature that I consider sufficient in itself, as one of the natural danger signals, warning people to stay away from it. Webster's behavior in court and the details of her personal life also turned society against her. Reporters everywhere described her as calm and dispassionate. Webster lost her composure only once when it came to her son. This contradicted the established ideas of a decent woman who, having found herself in such a situation, had to show remorse. A succession of male friends, one of whom became the father of her illegitimate child, assumed a promiscuous sex life, which again went against the norms of behavior. During the trial, Webster unsuccessfully tried to attract sympathy by condemning Strong, the father of her child, because he led her astray. With her complaint, Webster played on public perceptions that a woman's moral sense inextricably linked to her sexual frequency. Sexual decline should have led to a fall in other spheres. A man who was in a sexual relationship with a woman thereby assumed social obligations that he had to fulfill. Webster's attempt to accuse 3 innocent people also caused outrage. O'Donnell notes that the whole society, without a doubt, condemned Kate Webster, perhaps as for trying to drag 3 innocent people to the scaffold and for murder itself. According to Shani de Cruz of the feminist Edge Resec Network, the fact that Webster was Irish played a significant role in the attitude towards her in the UK. Many Irish emigrated to England after the Great Famine and faced widespread prejudice. The English and the Irish were associated with drunkenness and crime. They were not considered human. There were repeated episodes of violence between English and Irish workers. An attack by the Fenians, Irish separatists in England. The demonization of Webster as almost inhuman, according to Donnell, has become part of the public legal perception of the Irish as born criminals.